Hello, this is Geotech and today I'm going to be talking about the nonprofit and community-funded projects that are creating free and open source technology. I recently had a discussion with a politics YouTuber who goes by Econoboy. Econoboy makes very interesting videos about economics and is usually arguing in favor of progressive European-style capitalism. I decided to reach out and propose a different model that completely eliminates for-profit institutions. Free and open source technology is just as good, if not even better, than their for-profit counterparts. In our discussion, Econoboy did somewhat agree that free and open source technology can be just as good as the capitalist alternatives, but he did push back and argue that having a for-profit incentive will yield better results in terms of risk assessment and just overall deciding what gets prioritized in a project. Now, this had me somewhat confused because when I think of all the successful free and open source projects, I don't see how decision making is less efficient. In fact, I think it could even be more efficient in very different ways. Thankfully though, there are plenty of free and open source projects that I can look at and examine and see how they make decisions and prioritize things. So let's take a look. First up, we have Mastodon. Mastodon is free and open source software that allows anyone to build their own Twitter-like alternative. These independent communities can sync with each other, so you can follow anyone no matter which community you choose. The first question to ask is, why was Mastodon created in the first place? What was the motivation? Well, it certainly wasn't an attempt to make profit. There was a good article from Mashable back in 2017 at the time Mastodon started taking off. Eugen Roshko, the creator of Mastodon, describes how he was a heavy Twitter user but was tired of the toxic behavior being cultivated on the platform. In addition, the creator has said that another motivation was the possibility of Twitter being acquired by a billionaire. No, not that billionaire. It was an unnamed billionaire that was trying to acquire Twitter a few years back. So Eugen sought to create an alternative to Twitter that is decentralized, with much better anti-abuse tools. Each Mastodon community could create their own rules or moderation policy, but still connect with the wider Mastodon community. He took time out of his day, made Mastodon a success, and through crowdfunding on Patreon, he was able to work on Mastodon full-time. And it's not just him that works on Mastodon. Looking over at their GitHub page, there are plenty of volunteers and a few paid devs that continue to make Mastodon what it is today. Mastodon has since become a legitimate nonprofit based in Germany. So let's talk more about the motivations behind this platform. The Mastodon team obviously wants the platform to continue to grow, but not because of profit. They want it to grow so that Mastodon becomes a dominant social media platform, one that is not owned by a single corporation, where your timeline is not algorithm-based, designed to keep you addicted to the platform. And they want this kind of platform because it will be a good experience to use by the team themselves, the users, and won't have to use a platform owned by a corporation hell-bent on making and increasing profits at the user's expense. Sure, as Mastodon grows, it will likely mean more financial support through donations and sponsorships. So there is some financial incentive still at play there. More users lead to more financial support, which leads to making the experience on the platform even better. So let's talk about how finances are handled in this organization with no profit incentives. Even though there are plenty of good third-party apps, the team decided that there is a need to create official Mastodon apps for at least two reasons. One, to provide a much better onboarding experience for new users. The developers had come to the conclusion that a fair amount of users would not stick around on the platform too long. So they identified that a better onboarding experience could help with that. The second reason is that having official Mastodon apps on the iOS and Google Play stores would be good for organic discoverability of Mastodon. It's just a good way to advertise the Mastodon platform itself because the third-party apps have different names and might make things confusing for a new user looking into joining Mastodon. And for better retention and discoverability, Mastodon has since introduced an Explore tab where users can see what's trending and what users to follow. What's interesting is that all of these motivations are also found when you have a for-profit incentive. A company looking to make profit wants to grow and keep users on the platform. The difference is that Mastodon is not looking to make profit. So while both want to keep and grow users, Mastodon doesn't need to rely on ads, tracking, and doesn't need to increase engagement. Well, at least not to the extent where they want users to be addicted to the platform. They really just need some amount of engagement so as to keep Mastodon interesting enough to become and stay the dominant platform. While Mastodon has been one of the more successful projects, there are a few examples of other projects where things haven't gone as smoothly. Now let's talk about the GIMP project, which stands for the GNU Image Manipulation Program. GIMP is a very successful photo editing alternative that competes against Adobe Photoshop. It's a program not only popular with free and open source enthusiasts, but also with content creators, artists, photographers. This is a go-to app for a lot of people who cannot afford to pay for Adobe Photoshop, or who don't need Photoshop because GIMP meets all their needs. There is one issue with GIMP though, and that is their name. The word GIMP has a negative connotation, and several people in the community suggested an idea to rename and rebrand. However, the core GIMP devs have refused. The name has been with the team for more than 20 years. On their website, they even suggested taking their code and forking it into something else with a different name and branding. So on their website, this is what they had to say, and I quote, "We've been using the name GIMP for more than 20 years and it's widely known. The name was originally, and remains, an acronym. Although the word GIMP can be used offensively in some cultures, that is not our intent. On top of that, we feel that in the long run, sterilization of language will do more harm than good. GIMP has been quite popular for a long time in search engine results compared to the use of the word GIMP. So we think we are on the right track to make a positive change and make GIMP something people actually feel good about, especially if we add all the features we've been meaning to implement and fix the user interface. Finally, if you still have strong feelings about the name GIMP, you should feel free to promote the use of the long-form GNU Image Manipulation Program or exercise your software freedom to fork and rebrand GIMP." End quote. Those are some very powerful words, and a team did take them up on their offer. The team created a fork of GIMP called Glimpse, which I think is a much cooler sounding name. Their short-term goal was to take GIMP and give it a different branding, but then eventually make changes to the user interface to make it more accessible. Of course, Glimpse would still be a free and open source project, and so any changes they make to their codebase could also be used by the GIMP team. While the Glimpse team was doing well financially in terms of users donating to them on crowdfunding websites like Patreon and Open Collective, it seems like they didn't have enough people managing the day-to-day operations within the organization. So they went on a hiatus and the project has since been dormant. Although the project still exists, and there have been recent talks by some members of the team on creating an app from scratch based on new technology. Such is the nature of open source projects. There is always life to them as long as someone out there wants to make changes to the code or take it in a different direction. Maybe the Glimpse team makes a legitimate case that there may be an opportunity for GIMP to rebrand and possibly increase their user base. After all, it seems like the GIMP project is slow to make changes to their code, as they are currently still porting to the GTK3 toolkit when the GTK4 version has already released. I don't know this for certain, but I wonder if they could do something to get more developers to help out, or even hire more devs to work full-time. They could launch a fundraising campaign for this. Maybe rebranding would help, maybe it won't. Maybe the GIMP team is right that GIMP already is well recognized by the community and most don't have a problem with the name and therefore rebranding would actually lose the money and time. Now, you may point to this and see this as a failure of the free and open source nonprofit model. If there was a for-profit incentive, GIMP may have chosen a better name from the start, as they would have likely started out with a better marketing team and thus better branding. But there's many other projects like GIMP that are doing very well. Projects like Blender and Krita are very successful in the industries they serve. They both have cool names and no issues with branding. So even if you currently see GIMP as having unrealized potential, there's plenty of successful similar software that are doing fine. Let's take a look at another interesting project. The GNOME desktop is a popular Linux desktop environment developed by the nonprofit GNOME Foundation. It's very popular in the free and open source world and is used as the default Linux desktop environment in popular Linux distros like Ubuntu, Fedora, and Pop! OS. Despite its popularity, it has made controversial decisions. Back in 2011, they released GNOME 3, which was very different than their previous iteration. GNOME 3 went for a more minimalist desktop, even removing things like a minimize and maximize button. This alienated their user base who were used to a more traditional desktop environment found in GNOME 2. And what was the result of their decision? Well, it spawned plenty of forks. Different distros ended up forking GNOME 3 and putting back the more traditional desktop elements. Linux Mint forked GNOME 3 and created the Cinnamon desktop. Some even forked GNOME 2 and now is known as the Mate desktop. And they continue to maintain and update it to keep up with the latest technology. Ubuntu ended up ditching GNOME altogether and created their own desktop from the ground up called Unity. All of these desktop environments came about as a result of GNOME deciding to go in a completely different direction. But here's the key thing to remember. GNOME is open source, which made it easy for many different communities to fork it and go in those different directions. This is a good thing as it allows for more competition. And since all the forks are also open source, GNOME can borrow parts of those desktop environments if they wanted to. Some in the community believe having too many desktop environments leads to too much fragmentation, which harms the overall goal of producing a desktop that can compete against Windows and Mac OS. And that is true to some extent. I do think that the core devs or founders of an open source project should be willing to balance out the vision they want and the vision other members of their growing communities want. But there will be times when there are significant creative differences, and that's okay. Instead of fighting each other and slowing things down, I think it's healthy for there to be offshoots of a project. Having something like GNOME and many GNOME-based forks is kind of like a system of checks and balances. They can compete against each other, but at the same time, also collaborate since they can borrow code from each other. I think as a whole, free and open source organizations have been maturing over the years. If you want to prevent fragmentation, a project has to make an effort to meet the needs of many different users. Not only will it help prevent forks, but it would also help retain skilled developers. These days, GNOME is looking a lot better. With their most recent release, GNOME 42, seems to be better realizing the vision that the GNOME devs have wanted. They still offer a very minimalist desktop, and I personally would like to see them have alternative default desktop layouts to accommodate more users and prevent fragmentation. But they seem to be embracing the power of customization via a third-party system of desktop extensions. GNOME is so good these days that Ubuntu switched back to GNOME a few years ago. They abandoned their own custom Unity desktop, and to no surprise, those that liked Ubuntu's Unity continued the project under the Ubuntu Unity OS. But speaking of Ubuntu, several years back, at the peak of their popularity, they were set to release a Linux mobile operating system called Ubuntu Touch. Unfortunately, it was going to be a difficult task to compete against the dominant Android and iOS mobile operating systems. So that project was abandoned. But in typical open source fashion, the project was continued via the UBports community. What's interesting here is that Ubuntu, which is made by a for-profit company called Canonical, failed to deliver an open source alternative mobile OS. While Ubuntu Touch failed as a capitalist enterprise, it has succeeded being ran under a nonprofit model. UBports has now become a legit nonprofit and has been updating Ubuntu Touch and continued to port it to new Android phones and other devices. To recap here, projects that are free and open source allow for worldwide collaboration. If something goes wrong with the main project, they can be kept in check via forks. And I think that provides an incentive to operate efficiently and take into consideration the needs and wants of the wider community, or else risk losing some financial support from a subset of their user base and also lose skilled developers when they decide to fork their project. This also allows for plenty of creativity, innovation, and experimentation. I know a lot of people may say that many open source projects currently rely on large contributions made by for-profit institutions. For example, if you look at the Linux Foundation members, you can see almost every major tech company on there. They support Linux financially and make contributions to the Linux kernel to support their hardware and server software stack. Linux is what powers the cloud. Companies like Microsoft have their own Linux-based Azure, Amazon has AWS, Red Hat has RHEL. Another example is a popular screen capture project like OBS, which has sponsorship by YouTube, Logitech, Twitch, Facebook, and Nvidia. Many people, even those in the open source community, say that those capitalist institutions are essential for open source technology to thrive. But do we really need those private companies? Or can a different paradigm provide adequate funding? I believe so, and we actually see examples of alternative funding models in our current system. Let's go back to Mastodon. One important way that Mastodon is funded right now is through crowdsourcing via Patreon and Open Collective. I think this funding model has become more viable in the digital age because it's easy for information about a project to spread all over the globe, and the technology to donate is fairly easy to use. This user-funded system is definitely a key component on how many projects can get the funding they need to stay afloat, and in some cases, even to thrive and grow. Mastodon has been successful enough that it has even received grants from other nonprofits. Recently, they received a grant from the NLNet Foundation. And let me read from their website what they are all about. And I quote, "Since 1997, NLNet Foundation has been financially supporting organizations and people that contribute to an open information society. It funds those with ideas to fix the internet. The procedure is fast, competitive, and open to anyone. NLNet has contributed to funding many important and very visible projects around fundamental standards, all based on open standards and verifiable open source software and/or hardware. It has spawned the world-renowned NLNet Labs and supported great open source projects like Jitsi, ARPA2, WireGuard, NoScript, Tor Hidden Services, GPL v3, GNU-net, and WebODF, and many more." End quote. Another way we can fund projects is the old-fashioned way, through the government. Governments can give out loans and grants at the federal, state, and local levels, depending on the scope of the project. And this might be the way to go for bigger projects that normally can't rely on just crowdfunding or just have a high initial cost to develop. For example, something like designing and building cars will require a lot of resources and initial startup capital. Some may argue, though, that the government wouldn't be the best way to fund projects, as they would be very conservative on what they fund, or they would only fund projects that have an obvious benefit to society, which would stifle experimentation and thus innovation. While I think that is a valid concern, I think that can be fixed with legislation. Maybe there can be set quotas on the amount of projects they fund so that they leave a healthy amount of funding for experimentation. What I envision is an economic system composed purely of independent, non-profit, non-proprietary organizations. There would also be a highly democratic government that manages certain industries like healthcare, our mass transit system, education, etc. Very similar to the types of government that we see in many of the developed European countries. I mean, things like universal healthcare and universal college are effectively nonprofits themselves. And funding for free and open source software and hardware could be done through the government via a research and development branch, directly by the users through crowdfunding, or through independent nonprofit incubators where people could fund and vote democratically on what ideas get turned into working projects. It's more like the people themselves are the investors. We decide where our money goes for research and development and invest in projects we think will make our lives better. There would still be healthy competition among projects to obtain funding, and we wouldn't have to rely on private capital investments by megacorps or a wealthy investor class. If we allow for-profit companies along with a private investor class to coexist with nonprofits, they'd have an advantage. Even though many open source projects are competing and doing well against their for-profit counterparts in our current economic paradigm, there are actions they can take to stifle the competition. Private companies can take a financial loss temporarily to steal back market share. A big reason they can do that is because really wealthy people can continue investing in them. Let's say the Libre Office suite starts to gain traction in the business world over Microsoft's Office suite. Microsoft could start offering their suite at a really low price and use investor money to continue adding useful features and take a temporary financial loss. Some may see this as a good thing, as it is forcing Microsoft to work better for consumers. But Microsoft Office could regain its market share and thus its status as a dominant Office suite. And again, people become dependent on it, and so they eventually start slowly increasing the price, and then we are back in the same place. It is the for-profit company's imperative to grow, seek out new markets, privatize what they can, invest in lobbying the government to get what they want. Even if for-profit companies build their business model around non-proprietary technology, there's an added incentive to find ways to make it more proprietary, indirectly, also known as the embrace, extend, extinguish model. An example is Google's Android OS, which is open source, but heavily relies on the Play Store and Google Play services that make it harder to get popular apps and features on other de-Googled Android alternatives. So how can we get to this non-profit, non-proprietary system? Obviously, changes in our government are going to play a huge part. The USA needs to adopt many of the policies that are doing well for the people in European countries. The USA becoming a proper social democracy is a key step. But there is something unique and powerful about free and open source technology that will be critical to moving in this direction. The free and open source model has a unique ability of pitting companies against each other. Let's take a look at Google's Android again. Even though Google will try to make it more difficult for a de-Googled Android to be a legitimate alternative, it's still much better than what we have with proprietary alternatives. There is no open source version of macOS, iOS, and Windows. We couldn't create an independent version of any of those OSs, at least not legally. Despite the challenges, the fact that Android is non-proprietary has allowed different organizations to create an alternative mobile OS without having to reinvent the wheel. We have non-proprietary projects like Graphene OS, Calyx OS, Lineage OS, and the E Foundation, which are shipping versions of Android that respect a user's privacy, does not serve them ads, or doesn't feature any of Google's tracking. This is good for the end user. It can happen because Google is not in the business of making money off their OS directly. They don't mind that Android is open source because most mainstream vendors are shipping a version of Android that use Google's Play services and their ad tracking that is the key to how they make their money. Ultimately, what we have here is the open source model teaming up with Google to take on Windows and Mac OS. The open source model has also teamed up with Valve. Valve is embracing open source and making it possible to play Windows games on Linux, which is making it easier for many people to ditch Windows and use the Linux desktop. Maybe they are doing it because they genuinely believe in open source, or because they see Microsoft as competing against them by building up their own app store. Steam's business model is on selling software on their store, and the concern there is that Windows would kill their model with their own store. There was a time when there was a business model around building proprietary video codecs. Take H.264, which is patented and does require companies using it to pay royalties. But companies then joined together to create royalty-free alternatives such as libvpx and svt-av1 as examples. In the CPU space, you have the x86 instruction set with a licensing model that only Intel and AMD can make these CPUs. Things then shifted to a more open platform with ARM. ARM is also made by a for-profit company, but anyone can create CPUs using the ARM architecture as long as they pay royalties. So you have companies like Google, Apple, Samsung creating their own CPUs based on ARM. This openness and competition is good for innovation. It has even allowed a nonprofit like the Raspberry Pi organization to create a low-cost ARM-based PC. And even though the Pine64 team is not technically a nonprofit, they operate like one and have created affordable devices like the PinePhone and PineBook Pro, all based on ARM CPUs. But it hasn't stopped with ARM. Major tech companies have come together to create an alternative to ARM called RISC-V, which is similar to ARM except that now there are no royalties to be paid since the architecture is completely open source. So we constantly have companies who stand to profit from essentially making other companies obsolete by building open source alternatives. We also see current for-profit companies being constantly kept in check due to the fact that they build their businesses around open source. Red Hat recently was in the hot seat with the community when they decided to abandon the original mission of CentOS, which was a popular web server Linux OS. And due to the open source nature of everything Red Hat does, forks of CentOS came about, such as Rocky Linux. You also have the Audacity project, which was sold to a for-profit company. The software itself is open source, and when that company tried introducing telemetry into the software that their users didn't like, the project was forked by the community and removed that telemetry. There's also the Qt project, which is a popular cross-platform toolkit for creating software. Qt is owned by a for-profit company, and when they recently introduced an idea to make software updates to paying customers exclusive for 1 year, there was backlash in the community and also talks of possibly forking Qt. As you can see, free and open source technology has this inherent ability to make itself useful to businesses that then are used to take down other businesses and make technology more open. So to summarize here, I am arguing in favor of a system of independent, nonprofits, or community-funded organizations that use non-proprietary technology, and that's both in terms of software and hardware. I see this system producing a lot of creativity, innovation, collaboration. I'm planning on talking more about this in future videos, maybe expand on the ideas more, but I'm planning on writing something. I don't know if it's a book or some sort of document, but the way I see it is like a blueprint of this system that is open source though. So anyone else can modify it and improve the different areas or the different sectors that it covers. So stay tuned for that. Do you want to see this type of world of independent nonprofits and community-funded projects? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you like this video, please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you all next time. If you're enjoying my video, you can subscribe to me on YouTube, PeerTube, follow me on Odyssey. You could also support me on Libre, Patreon. See links in the description below.